Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. What do you think of when you see a Civil War monument? If it makes you think of dusty old history textbooks, then I have the cure. Our guest today has made it his goal to bring those statues to life and tell the stories of the real people who fought the battles. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is best-selling historical novelist Jeff Shaara, who recently completed a guidebook titled Jeff Shaara's Civil War Battlefields, Discovering America's Hallowed Ground, describing 10 battlefields he says every American should visit. Jeff was a guest of the January series of Calvin College. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
What does visiting a battlefield tell us that reading a book or seeing a movie can't?
Well, first of all, there's two kinds of battlefields to visit. One is the kind that has unfortunately been destroyed by modern development. I mean, when you have fast food restaurants right in the middle of where something enormously historically important
Kind of
happened.
spoils the mood.
Yeah, it spoils the mood. But the other kind of battlefield, which is what I focus on in this book, is those that are in a fabulous state of preservation and hopefully will remain that way. The idea is to go to these pieces of ground. I mean, this affects me when I'm researching my own books. It started with my father when he was researching his book, The Killer Angels at Gettysburg. Walking in the footsteps of historical figures, seeing what they saw. Beyond the canon and the monuments and the things you see at a typical Park Service site, there's something about the ground, about trying to understand, if you have any interest at all in history, about what happened.
Sure.
You can't get it from a textbook. In the same way I say in the introduction to this book, the battlefield is not to a museum the way the jungle is not a zoo. I mean, going to a zoo is not going to give you the experience of going to a jungle. The battlefield, walking the ground, and literally bloody footsteps, to get graphic about it. When I'm researching a book and I want to know what it was like for 500 men to walk up a hill into the guns of their enemies, and somehow they kept going. I mean, somehow with the guns firing, these men continued to walk as the guy next to them suddenly goes down, that whistle of the musket balls over their head. If I'm going to write about that to you and tell you that story, it's awfully advantageous if I've walked that same hill.
Sure.
And I know what it looks like, and I know where the trees were and the rocks. Beyond that, there really is a spiritual sense of when you're on some of these places. What I would like to recommend sometimes people going to, the best example is probably Gettysburg. You can go to Gettysburg in July for the reenactments, the anniversary of the battle, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. It's an enormous event. I mean, there are thousands of reenactors there, really interesting things to do. You can go to the souvenir stand and buy all the things and so forth. You can buy books, certainly. What I like to do is go in the middle of wintertime, which is not when the battle happened, but go out on a field when there's no one around and walk through Devil's Den or walk through Little Round Top, or go to, I mean, whether it's not just Civil War, go to Valley Forge, go to the North Bridge at Concord, where the famous Emerson poem about the shot heard round the world. Go to Pearl Harbor, go to Omaha Beach. Walk the ground when there's no one else around, and something happens. It's really an odd experience to feel as though you're part of that history. For me to write this, for me to tell you these stories, I don't think I could do it at all without walking in those footsteps.
So the material is really important to you. When I was, I mean, the material, what we can touch, what we can feel. When I was about 10 years old, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and in our church there was a glass display case with some old stuff from the church, and there was a jar of mud. And I asked my dad about it one day, and it was flood mud. There was in 1913 a great flood that covered Dayton, and he took me out and showed me the water lines on the pews. And it was the first time in my life that I realized that history was about here and now and real people, and not about groups and nations and worldwide events, but it was individuals, and it was and it happened to people, and it happened materially. And it sounds as if you're saying sort of about the battlefields that, yeah, your feet need to make contact.
Well, that's exactly what I do, is I tell you the stories of the people.
Right.
I don't write textbooks. I'm not interested in reading that stuff any more than most students are. And when you read a typical historical textbook, I mean, again, let's go to, you know, some place like the Battle of Fredericksburg, for example. You know, you can read an account, and here it is, and here's the facts and figures, and here's how many guys died, and here's what they did, and this regiment did that. Oh, okay, that's fine if you want to pass a test.
But that's like studying football plays, I think. I mean, I was thinking
it's a good parallel.
As I looked at you've got maps in the Battlefields book, and they're interesting. They show the strategies and the maneuvers, and at some point, looking at those maps, I began to think, well, this and maybe it was because it was near the Fiesta Bowl time that I was reading, but I was thinking this is a bit like thinking about the strategies in a football game. But when I go back to your novels and back to the narrative parts of this Battlefield book, the people come back into it.
Well,
it becomes personal
the point is, this
again.
book is not aimed at the academic historian who knows the history. So part of the book was telling you what happened. I mean, if you go to the battlefield, say at Fredericksburg or Antietam or Chickamauga or Shiloh, my goal here was the family was on a summer vacation. You know, husband, wife, couple of kids in the back seat. They're driving through the rural countryside in Tennessee. They see a sign on the side of the road that says Shiloh National Military Park.
Should we stop?
Why should we stop? What is there to see there? Well, first of all, if you're not a Civil War buff, you don't know what happened at Shiloh.
Right.
But the point of this book to tell you, first of all, okay, here's what happened. You know, here is exactly where the armies were. Here's what Ulysses Grant did. Here's what Braxton Bragg did. Here's what Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed there. You know, and why was that important? Here's the place he was killed. So it's a very interesting, sort of gut-wrenching sort of an experience. But that's the point, is to take those people who aren't the Civil War buffs, show them the experience, show them, okay, now walk the ground. Here's what happened. Here's why it's important. That's the other part. It's not just a history lesson. This changed history.
Each chapter you have a section on why this matters.
Why is this important? And then the third part of each chapter is what is there to see.
Or your working subtitle was 10 battlefield sites every American should visit. You feel really strongly that we need to see these places.
Well, it started out, first of all, as the battlefield sites I should visit.
Okay.
I mean, it was my own philosophy about this. I didn't want to sound like I was, you know, preachy about this, that I was sort of talking to you from some sort of superiority. It's not that. When I say a spot every American should visit, the idea is that we are woefully unconnected to our own history. Maybe it's the educational system in this country. I don't know. I hear a lot of that from teachers who are using my books in their classrooms as a way of bringing the students into the history by giving them a face, a character they can relate to. We are woefully disconnected. I was asked recently, my latest book on the Second World War, The Rising Tide, and someone said, oh, were you in the Second World War?
Wow.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not in my late 70s.
Wasn't that in the 60s?
Yeah. And that kind of thing, it bothers me that people are not being taught, young people are not being taught enough about our history to understand, not just memorize all the facts and figures.
I think we get, as I read Gods and Generals, as I read the Battlefield book, I would think, oh, I vaguely remember reading about this battle, but it didn't stick because it was only names and it was only statistics.
That's right. And when I began researching all of this, I mean, when I began researching the American Revolution, for example, I have 2 books on the American Revolution. I mean, I know who John Adams is, and Ben Franklin, and George Washington, but I didn't know the story. I didn't know what it was like for John and Abigail Adams, what it was like for George Washington trying to hold his army together, what it was like for Benjamin Franklin in Paris seducing King Louis into coming into the war on the American side, which changed the history of the world. So it's not about a textbook, it's about get into those personalities, tell the stories, see, and at the end of the day, these people are us. This is who we are. These are not just statues in the park. These are not mythical names up on some marble pedestal. This is who we are. These people are just like us. And whether you're writing from the American Revolution, from the Civil War, World War I, now I'm working in World War II, I find that all the way through. These are Americans for the most part. There are other characters as well, but I mean, this is America. This is where we came from, and it's who we are, and most people simply don't know that.
There are war monuments. You pass a statue every once in a while here and there, or go to a battlefield and there'll be a monument. How can we learn to see them freshly, so that we don't just pass by and? That's
the whole point of this book.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, is to tell you, okay, here's a monument. I use the example Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh. Here's his monument. Here's this big thing, and you look up and there he is, and right, he's on a horse and so forth. But no, here's where the man died. Okay, not only for his sake are we looking at this monument that this man was killed here, but who was he? Why was that important? Why did that change history? Yeah. We may never have heard of Robert E. Lee if Albert Sidney Johnston had survived Shiloh. Why? Well, that's a question a lot of people, I mean, even a lot of Civil War buffs will debate, but it's a question most people have no idea.
Have never considered.
Who was this man? Why was his death important? And then you find out, well, he wasn't just killed in a battle. How he died is an amazing tragedy. I mean, what happened to this man? And this follows all the way through in all the stories I've done. The Stonewall Jackson is another excellent example. The man killed, shot by his own men in the Civil War in 1863. What might have happened had they not
had that gone
panicked,
differently?
Had they gone differently? All the way through this process, this kind of experience, this is a part of the story, and it's a part of our history that too often is just glossed over by one sentence in a textbook, but we don't know the story.
I appreciate that in your novels you give alternating perspectives, so each chapter is given from a different character's viewpoint, and we see the story unfolding from several perspectives. Do you find at the battlefields that the perspectives, that the sort of official perspectives of the monuments and the guidebooks and so forth, are they fair, are they unbiased, or do you tend to see the deck stacked?
It depends. I mean, there are the official Park Service stuff has to be unbiased because there's politically correct issues and all things like that. But they're so unbiased that they're sanitary. I mean, they pull themselves away from the actual events. What I've tried to do is, I mean, first of all, in all of my stories, there are no bad guys. This is not John Wayne and the guys in the black hats. I mean, these are the stories of individuals on both sides, and when you're talking the Civil War, I mean, you've got Union, you've got Confederate. Well, politically correct things now say, well, the Confederates were bad, so, you know, we need to emphasize that. That's not what I do. I tell the story from their points of view.
I think that's really significant because growing up, I remember history books, and I think many adults continue this throughout their lives. We sort of assume that the other side, whatever that other side may be, is somehow willfully evil, that they're driven by knowingly evil motives. And the Civil War especially is complicated because it's all us. Right. It's all home. And so I really appreciate the way you try to give a sympathetic view of all things.
Well, it's not necessarily taking a bad guy or a villain, if you will, and trying to make this person sympathetic. I mean, in my latest book on the Second World War, I had an enormous challenge because I'm writing from the perspective of Erwin Rommel. Now, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, German in North Africa, this is a man who's fighting for Hitler. Right. Now, how do you paint a portrayal, a sympathetic portrayal of his character? But the more I research Rommel, first of all, he's not this two-dimensional, you know, just goose-stepping bad guy Nazi. He's not a Nazi at all. He never joins a Nazi party. He's implicated in the plot to kill Hitler. Beyond that, he understands that Hitler is insane. He says this. And all of that fleshed out the character for me. And if it doesn't get fleshed out for me, I can't flesh it out for you. But he's a three-dimensional human being. He's a marvelous battlefield general. He could have won the war for Hitler in North Africa. It's a story most people don't realize. So I get away in the American Revolution books, the British characters. Well, the British are the bad guys. But in fact, they're not bad guys. Right. I mean, you have characters like Charles Cornwallis, who's a fascinating man. And had he been given control of his army the way he wanted it, George Washington would have lost the war. And again, the stories are stories we simply don't know. Get away from the one-dimensional stuff and just tell a good story. That's really what I try to do. It's what I try to do here.
I think reading both the novels and the Civil War Battlefields book has helped me appreciate, we look at current conflicts in our world, and it's hindsight is 20/20, or a lot of us think it is. And reading about these way back wars, I can recognize how difficult it is to be in the position of having to make the decisions and considering the options. I was also interested in how, as you create the characters in your novels, you do show their failings and their weaknesses. Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, he's a teacher at VMI, and not a very good one. He memorizes his lectures the night before and delivers them, and people try to stay awake. And he's got real strengths as a military leader, but that's not where he starts out. And he knows that.
Right.
And I was really taken with his own sense of inadequacy about that.
Well, some of the documentaries that you see on the History Channel or whatever, they tend to focus on, you know, Stonewall Jackson was a madman on the battlefield and this fanatical, the killing machine. It's like, no, he wasn't. He was a three-dimensional human being who had a little girl, his daughter he had only seen once. All he wanted to do was go home. He wanted to go home to his wife and his child, raise a family, continue his life, get this war over with.
A lot of these fellows just wanted to be left alone and stay out of it.
The Red Baron in World War I. I mean, I did a documentary for the History Channel about the Red Baron, and the other historians involved, some of them were saying, well, the man was, as I just said, was a killing machine. They kept using that term. That's ridiculous. The man he's a fighter pilot, he's the best there is, but he's also us. He's also simply a human being. He wants the war to be over as much as anybody else. He wants to go home. That's the point through all of this, is there's heroism, there are reasons why these people are famous. There's reasons why they're on the statues. But there's so much more to the characters than that. And it's the whole point of this is to get beyond that, to explore who these characters are, to relate to them. Students who can relate to them because they see themselves. They see someone with the same kinds of traits.
And if you can see yourself in a character who becomes great, maybe you have the potential to become great as well. I think it also shows us the tragic potential of these
very
big
definitely. Well, it shows us the tragic potential of war.
Sure,
I mean, one of the reasons I'm drawn to the people are always asking me, why do you focus on war stories? It's not the war that draws me, it's the characters and how these people respond, how they rise to an occasion. In every military action that has ever existed in the world, you have those ordinary people suddenly, you know, the sergeant who rises up to take command of his company because his captain is killed. I mean, all the way through the process, I mean, whether it's George Washington, who survives incredible, just horrible situations, to manage his army, which isn't even an army, and defeat the finest army in the world, the British at the time, and give us our country. I mean, what made this man do that? How did that happen? That's what, maybe you can tell, that's what gets me excited about this. And I hope that's what brings the reader to this.
It struck me, you write about Matthew Brady and the importance of photography in making people aware of what was going on the battlefield in a way that they never had been before. I have learned all my life that World War I changed the ways wars were fought. And that's true, but I hadn't thought about how significant the changes in Civil War, battle technology, but also people's awareness of what was happening. So Matthew Brady and his teams out there with the cameras are making war less glorious by showing it how it really is. But it struck me that there's a parallel there with what you're trying to do.
Exactly.
Well.
I mean, the word glory and the word war for centuries, they were interconnected.
Right.
What Matthew Brady did and what happened during the American Civil War is the American people suddenly are having on their newspapers that they can take home to their living rooms, here's a photograph of the battlefield at Antietam after the battle, and here are the bodies, and here's the horror right there. They've never seen that before. You can't begin to even quantify what that meant to the American people, what it was like to see that. When you had World War I, you had the motion picture. You had film so here's motion photography of troops rising up out of the trenches and running across this desolate, horrible open ground with the explosions going off and guys dying, and you're watching it live. That very much changed. Of course, now, I mean, fast forward to today, and you have, CNN and Fox and so forth, and here you have the cruise missile going down the silo of some building, and you're watching it as it goes in. Well, the problem with technology is that you don't see who's on the other end of the cruise missile.
Right.
When you're dealing in the Civil War, where you have the man with the bayonet and you have the other man, you see the faces. Yeah. And I think we always need to see the faces.
I agree. There were other just interesting details in the Civil War book. The use of hydrogen balloons. I didn't even think about them being available, but people went up, or they were...
That was an enormous leap of technology. I mean, think about just the simple idea of getting this guy hanging in a basket from the bottom of a hydrogen balloon, going up in the air, just so he can look out over the battlefield and see the enemy's position. Now, the Union Army did this first, and they were mostly used predominantly at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And the Union Army, I mean, they're on the other side of the Rappahannock River. They need to see where Lee's army is. Lee's looking over on his hill. He's looking across, and he sees these things going up in the air. And it's these hydrogen balloons, these big fat sausages rising up over the countryside. And the Confederacy was slow to catch on. They didn't realize. Now, also, take it one step further. Think about the guy in the basket.
I just did what nerve, what courage.
The first man to climb in that basket and say, okay, now you're going to go up, and we're holding onto a rope. So
there's a Bonanza episode, oddly enough, in which the youngest son accidentally is guarding this balloon that a military official has brought out to test, and his brother Haas unleashes the rope to send him up, and he's terrified, and as well.
Well, I try to imagine when the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, climbs into a biplane for the first time, and yet what was it like for those guys climbing into those boxes with this unreliable motor on the front? Oh yes, and by the way, somebody's going to be shooting at them when they're doing it, and they have to shoot back. All the technology from the balloon to the tank, you have to ride inside this metal coffin. Basically, the submarine. Okay, now we're going to get you in this thing, close it up, and go underwater, and hope you don't drown.
Do you think, I wanted to ask you, do you think that there are either technologies or strategies that have throughout, now you've written on several wars, I don't know how to ask this, are wars getting better? Are wars getting more humane or more effective or more efficient?
I think it's the opposite.
Okay.
And the reason, I touched on it before, when you've got in the American Revolution, the British, talk about technology, nitpicking, the British had the bayonet. The Americans did not.
Right.
When these two groups of guys march up like this, they fire the first shot, now there's nothing else, it takes too long to load the musket, so the next thing they do is charge with the bayonet. The Americans don't have them. That creates a very one-sided...
Puts them at a disadvantage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, fast forward, so when the Americans begin to pick up bayonets on the battlefield and somebody gets a clue, Washington's army, put these things on your gun, it actually works, and the gun really is a handle, a long handle for the bayonet. Well, fast forward to in 1914, the French are still on horseback with their flags flying and their bright-colored uniforms charging across the battlefield against the Germans. Now the Germans have the machine gun. That doesn't work if you're a cavalryman. I mean, horses don't fare well against machine guns. Keep going all the way, fast forward to the tank, now you have the nuclear submarine underneath the sea who can launch, however many nuclear warheads at an enemy who never knows they're coming, doesn't even know where they're coming from, or the cruise missile. You become detached from your enemy.
The less personal, the easier it is to kill, right?
It becomes a video game.
Yeah.
And the problem with making war a video game is you tend to lose the impact of what war is. There is a horror to war. There's a horror to any war, whether it's 300 years ago, 5,000 years ago, or today. That horror is still there. People die. People die in gruesomely awful ways. Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe it's not about politics. This has nothing to do with politics. But it's about the fact that war is what it is. And mankind, people are always asking me, do you think we'll ever stop doing this? I don't. I have a very pessimistic view of human nature. There will always be this kind of conflict. And if we make it sanitary, if we make it where we don't have to look at the pictures of the bodies,
then it's too easy.
It's too easy.
I did think you write these stories in ways that I initially thought I knew people who were sort of war buffs who loved to read war history, and when I was younger, I was always a little suspicious of that. What does that mean? And yet, as I read your books, I realized that you're not glorifying it. You're making it real and interesting and compelling, and it was very moving to me. The more I read about the Civil War, the more complicated the issues seem to me, and the harder it is to imagine what it would be like. Robert E. Lee didn't want to get into the war. But he didn't want his home taken away either, and so he had to do what he had to do. So I'm thinking these people who have now seen the photographs, who didn't want the war in the first place, nobody seemed to want the war.
No.
And yet the stakes are so high that they'll make that sacrifice.
I have been accused of being pro-war in my books and anti-war in my books.
Okay.
I've gotten it both ways.
Yeah.
The point is, it's not, first of all, I don't know how anyone can read about what happens on a battlefield or what happens from the point of view of a soldier, what this person goes through, and feel good about it. I mean, the man who's the hero. I mean, I have a lot of heroic, fabulous characters in the books that I embrace. I love these people, and it's the only way I can tell their stories, to get into their heads and feel like I really love these characters. But what they experience changes them. always changes them. They go home from this young Marine private in my World War I book named Roscoe Temple, a 19-year-old Marine. What he experiences on the battlefield in France, Belleau Wood, these famous battles, what it's like from his point of view. He goes home, his life is never the same. The pilots who shoot down their enemy and watch the guy die in front of them or go down in flames, what that does to a man, how it affects his psyche when he goes home. I think anyone, people, now I'm doing World War II. Well, they're living veterans, and people are always saying to me, oh, you need to go talk to my neighbor. He was in the war. The point is, no, it's not up to me to ever push that button. Someone cautioned me, be very careful of the guy who puts his arm around your shoulder and wants to tell you all his war stories, because there's a very good chance that guy didn't do that stuff.
It's the war veterans I know won't talk about the war stuff.
That's right. The guys who really did the stuff, who were out there where it was bad,
they're too moved.
They don't want to talk about it. It has affected them, changed their life. I have a father-in-law who was with Patton in the Third Army in Europe in World War II. He was missing in action for 2 weeks. He came home with a German officer's Luger as a souvenir. He will never talk about where he got it, how, what he had to do to get it. We have no idea. And that's really the point, is that everyone who experiences this is changed by it. So if we don't have those stories, if we don't really know, that's my job. Go back, find the research, find the memoirs, the diaries, the collections of letters, put these stories together to show you what it was like. Now, it's not all, there's a disclaimer here. It's not all horror. People always say to me, I don't like to read war books. I don't want to read the blood and guts and all that kind of.
It's not all
That's
horror.
really not what it is. It's about you and me and what it would be like for us. And some of it's funny. There has to be humor to these stories. There has
and there
to
are
be.
love stories and coming-of-age stories.
All of that, absolutely. It's human. It's us.
My guest today has been best-selling historical novelist Jeff Shaara, author of Jeff Shaara's Civil War Battlefields. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.